In one of his most recent videos, biblical scholar Dan McClellan presented the evidence for the passages in the biblical text that pertain to God's dad, as well as the idea that Yahweh was once a junior member of a pantheon of gods, which the Northwest Semitic high deity El presided over. Now, this video is not a rebuttal against Dan. I like Dan, I appreciate his work, and I love his approach of data over dogma. The goal of this video is simply to present the other side of the discussion, and that is that Yahweh is the supreme deity within the Israelite religion, and also the head of the divine council, a view that is completely compatible with monotheism. So let's dive right in. Now, in an effort to offer the other side of the coin, I'm going to be pulling from the work of the late and great biblical scholar Dr. Michael S. Heiser, who unfortunately passed away just over 2 years ago. But Dr. Heiser's specialty when it came to biblical studies was Deuteronomy 32, specifically the divine council. His dissertation from the University of Madison, Wisconsin, was titled The Divine Council in Late Canonical and Non-Canonical Second Temple Jewish Literature. He also wrote numerous articles on this topic, as well as you can see at the top of the screen here, the book titled The Unseen Realm. And on a personal note, Dr. Heiser changed my life. He is the reason for this channel. And in fact, I often reference him as my unmet mentor. That being said, I'm going to include links to his works below. All right, so let's dive right into the material. The first thing that I want to touch on is an instance where it seemed that Dan misspoke in his talk. And this is not, I'm not criticizing him for misspeaking. We all do it. But here's the clip of it.
When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods.
And where I believe Dan misspoke on this was where he said, according to the number of the gods. However, on Dan's screen, the text actually said this as well. But immediately after this, Dan went on to talk about how more traditional translations of the Bible will say, according to the number of the sons of Israel, or the children of Israel, and that this is the reading that is preserved in the Masoretic text, but that the Septuagint refers to the number of the angels of God. And this is something that scholars had recognized, that the Septuagint translators like to render angels of God when the text had no angels. And then because of this, perhaps the Septuagint translators had an earlier Hebrew source text that referred to the number of the sons of God. And then Dan presented really well the discovery of 4Q Deuteronomy J, which confirmed the hypothesis that the earlier reading referred to the number of the children of God, not the number of the sons of Israel. And the reason that I suggested that Dan misspoke here was because he provided support and then seemed to confirm the view that the correct translation should read sons of God. And again, I'm not trying to criticize Dan for making a mistake. We all misspeak. I simply wanted to provide some clarity because when I initially listened to it, it was a bit confusing to me. And I agree with Dan that the correct reading of this passage should be sons of God. And in fact, Dr. Heiser wrote an article titled Deuteronomy 32:8 and the Sons of God. It's a great article. Give it a read. But in his concluding statement, he says, in light of the evidence, there exists no textual or theological justification for preferring the Masoretic text reading. Deuteronomy 32:8 should read sons of God, not sons of Israel. Now, regarding Dan's explanation of the number of the sons of God being 70, I thought Dan provided one of the best summaries on this topic that I have ever heard. He talked about the children of Israel at the end of Genesis being 70, the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10 being 70, and also because of the connection to the Ugaritic literature. And it's at this point that Dan transitions into Yahweh, or Adonai, being one of the 70 sons of God that receives a nation.
So this passage seems to be referring to the idea that there are 70 nations and there are 70 B'nai Elohim, or children of God. And then the passage goes on. Adonai's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. So the nations are being apportioned to the B'nai Elohim, and Adonai gets one. You don't get an inheritance from yourself. You get an inheritance from someone else. And the nation of Israel is referred to as Adonai's inheritance in a number of places.
Now, as I said at the beginning, this video is offering the other side of the coin on this issue. And so it's at this point that you're really going to see the viewpoints become polar opposites. And there's a couple things to break down here from Dan's video. One is the idea that the nations are being apportioned to the sons of God and that Yahweh gets one of these as a son of God. And also the fact that you don't get an inheritance from yourself. An inheritance is something that someone gives you. And so the first thing that is worth noting here is that within Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, it never actually says that Yahweh received or was given anything. It simply reads in verse 9, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. And this word Lord in all caps is the divine name Yahweh or Adonai. But what's interesting to note about verse 9 is that verse 9 is made up of verbless clauses. And so the idea that Elion, or the Most High, is giving the subordinate Yahweh his portion actually has to be read into the passage. It's not stated anywhere. And this is allowing one's presuppositions to guide the interpretation. And what I mean by this is that the presupposition is that the Most High, or Elion, in verse 8, is a separate deity than Yahweh. That's a presupposition that you're coming into the text with. And so if you have that as the presupposition, you can look back and say, well, Elion gave the nations their inheritance. And then in verse 9, it says that Yahweh has a portion. And so therefore, Elion had to give Yahweh his portion. But again, this is something that's not stated in the text. And there's more data points than simply the verbless clauses to provide evidence for Elion, or the Most High, and Yahweh being the same. Firstly, it's worth noting that the event that Deuteronomy 32 is describing when it talks about the Most High giving the nations their inheritance, dividing mankind, fixing the borders. This is a reference back to the division of nations as described in Genesis chapter 11. Now, Genesis chapter 10 is the table of nations, but Genesis chapter 11 gives the description of how this happened. And what's interesting to note about this is that Genesis chapter 11 is attributed to the J source. If you're familiar with the documentary hypothesis or the JEPD theory, which is the theory surrounding the authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible, the J source is the oldest source. It is the Yahweh source, and it is dated to around the 10th century BCE. And J has Yahweh doing the dividing in Genesis chapter 11. And what's very interesting to note about this is that if you look through the table of nations, Israel is not yet a nation. And then in Genesis chapter 12, this is the J source again. J has Yahweh calling out Abram, and it's not until Abram becomes Abraham, and then later has a grandson named Jacob, and Jacob is renamed Israel. That happens twice. And then eventually through Israel's 12 sons, you get the 12 tribes and ultimately the people of Israel. And so one of the questions that we can ask from this is that if Deuteronomy 32 is describing Elion and Yahweh as 2 separate entities, and it's drawing on the event of Genesis 11 as recorded by the J source, how could J have missed the polytheistic outlook known to whoever wrote Deuteronomy 32? Because again, the J source has Yahweh doing the dividing, and then ultimately Yahweh calling out a man named Abram and his wife Sarai, who then become Abraham and Sarah, and who eventually through them, the nation of Israel, Jacob, his allotted heritage, comes from. And we can also ask the question, is J later than Deuteronomy 32? Now, another issue with Yahweh receiving Israel, which we just established did not exist yet, from his father El, is that this is internally inconsistent within Deuteronomy as a whole. If we go to chapter 4, verses 19 through 20, we read, "And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord," again, this is the divine name, "things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are to this day." Now, these two verbs that you see highlighted here, allotted, which is halak in Hebrew, and the word taken, which is lakah. Neither the verb forms or the ideas are passive. In other words, Israel was not given to Yahweh by El in this passage. So again, this is Yahweh acting alone. There's no indication here that Yahweh is given Israel by El. And a statement from Dr. Heiser that I think summarizes this pretty well is this: in view of the close relationship of Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 to Deuteronomy 4, 19 through 20, it is more consistent to have Yahweh taking Israel for his own terrestrial allotment by sovereign act as Lord of the council. And he's speaking in terms here of the divine council. Now, the pushback to this is going to be the traditional dating of the book of Deuteronomy. As you can see up here, Deuteronomy's chapter 5 through 26 are dated to the 8th to 7th centuries. This is the time of Josiah. It's the core of the book. Then you have Deuteronomy 27 and 28 added in exile as an explanation for the exile. Then you have Deuteronomy 1 through 4 and 29 through 34, which are added after the exile. However, Deuteronomy chapter 32 and 33 are considered originally independent and pre-exilic. And so again, to quote Dr. Heiser here, he says that one notices immediately how Deuteronomy 1 through 4 are conveniently dated as post-exilic, and Deuteronomy 32 through 33 are likewise conveniently considered independent and pre-exilic. Those who see Deuteronomy 1 through 4 as post-exilic would say that the reason Deuteronomy 4, 19 through 20 has Yahweh taking his inheritance and no mention of other gods is that Israelite religion had evolved away from that belief by the end of the exile. And another point Dr. Heiser has made regarding Deuteronomy 4 in regards to Yahweh and Elion in an online back and forth exchange was this: that Deuteronomy 4 is to be dated after the exile. I would disagree with this. There's nothing in the text that makes this evident. But this is a crucial idea for the evolutionary view, since Israel's presumed polytheism needs some point in Israel's history. That point is posited as the exile or shortly after the exile. Israel's response to exile is considered the impetus for the leap to monotheism. And he goes on to challenge the individual or anyone else to, quote, show me why Deuteronomy 4 must be exilic or post-exilic, as opposed to merely later than Deuteronomy 32. I am on firm grounds with other scholars, Frank Moorcross of Harvard, for example, in placing Deuteronomy 4 late in the pre-exilic period. And there's also another scholar, Paul Sanders, who devotes 70 pages to the issue of intertextual links between Deuteronomy 32 and other portions of the Hebrew Bible. And he finds pre-exilic and post-exilic elements in the chapter. And there's another individual, I believe his name is pronounced Yigal Bloch, but based on the work he has done on the grammatical structures of some of the poetry within the Hebrew Bible, which would include Deuteronomy 32, he says that these grammatical identifiers justify dating these poems a couple of centuries before the Babylonian exile, i.e. to the 8th through the 7th, or perhaps even the 9th centuries BCE, but it does not provide justification for dating these poems to the 13th to 10th centuries BCE. And that is something that is important to consider when we take into consideration the J source being to around the 10th century BCE, and the J source being the author of Genesis 11 as well as 12. And that the J source is the source that had Yahweh dividing the nations back in Genesis chapter 11. And Dan does elaborate a little bit more on the distinction between Adonai and Elion, and this is a continuation from where the last clip that we watched of him left off.
And so A lot of scholars recognize these two passages, which were probably passed down to the authors of the Song of Moses from earlier generations, which seem to reflect an early distinction between Adonai and Elyon, where Adonai is among the Bnei Elohim, among the children of God, and Elyon is to be identified with El, the Northwest Semitic high deity. And this would fit with the theory that Adonai was brought into the Israelite pantheon initially on the second tier, adopting the divine profile of Baal, who in Ugaritic literature is among the children of El as well, and occupies the second tier of the pantheon.
Now, one thing that's critical to note when we talk about whether or not there is a distinction between Adonai and Elyon in Deuteronomy 32 is that Ugaritic scholars have noted that the title Most High is never used of El in the Ugaritic corpus. In point of fact, it is Baal, a second-tier deity, who twice receives this title as the ruler of the gods. And the point here is simply to dismiss the argument that the mere occurrence of the term Elyon in Deuteronomy 32 definitively points to El. And due to the well-established Baal epithets that are given to Yahweh within the biblical text that we'll see here momentarily, the title in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 could conceivably point directly to Yahweh rather than El. And I think it's also worth noting that although Elyon is paired with El in the Hebrew Bible, it is most often an epithet of Yahweh. And here is the passage from the Ugaritic literature. This is from the Kirta Tablet 3, column 3, and it equates Baal with the Most High. It says, "Look to the earth for Baal's rain, to the field for the rain of the Most High. For Baal's rain benefits the earth, and the rain of the Most High the field." So you can see this is a clear correlation between Most High and Baal. And as just mentioned, the biblical writers use many Baal epithets to refer directly to Yahweh within the biblical text. This is a prime example of polemic literature. One clear example of this is Psalm 47, verse 2. And it states, "For Yahweh, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth." Again, that's the divine name there. So we see here that the Most High is attributed to Yahweh within this particular psalm. And I was reading an article that was arguing for an 8th century BCE dating of Psalm 78. You might be thinking, what does Psalm 78 have to do with Psalm 47? But this particular article spoke on the similarities between Psalm 78 and Psalm 49. And the author stated when talking about these similarities, it indicates that the author of Psalm 78 was actively drawing from Psalm 49. And the author quoted another scholar in the footnotes who stated that the source of the opening of Psalm 49 is to be found in the Korah Psalms, especially in Psalm 47. And so if this individual is correct in their dating of Psalm 78 to the 8th century BCE, and that it is drawing off Psalm 49, which is drawing off Psalm 47, then that would mean that Psalm 47 is at least 8th century BCE, potentially earlier. However, this is not the only instance where Most High occurs as a title for Yahweh within the biblical text. There are many instances in the Psalms where this occurs. There's also Daniel, there's 2 Samuel, and then obviously what we've been looking at, Deuteronomy 32, although I understand there's an asterisk by that because of the current discussion that we're having. And one point that I mentioned earlier that is worth noting again is that separating El and Yahweh in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 is internally inconsistent within Deuteronomy 32 and Deuteronomy at large. We talked about that in reference to Deuteronomy 4, 19, and 20. However, this can also be demonstrated by looking at the preceding verses 6 and 7, which states, "Do you thus repay Yahweh, you foolish and senseless people? Is he not your father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you." And Dr. Heiser, when commenting on these two verses, had this to say, "Those two verses attribute no less than 5 well-recognized El epithets to Yahweh, demonstrating that the redactors who fashioned Deuteronomy recognized the union of El with Yahweh, as one would expect at this point in Israel's religion." And he went on to say, "Since the El epithets of Deuteronomy 32, 6 through 7 are well known to scholars of Israelite religion, those who argue that Yahweh and El are separate deities within Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 are left to explain why the redactor of verses 6 and 7 would unite Yahweh and El, and in the next stroke separate them. Those who crafted the text of Deuteronomy 32 would have either expressed diametrically oppositional views of Yahweh's status in consecutive verses, or have allowed a presumed original separation of Yahweh and El to stand in the text, while adding verses 6 through 7 in which the names describe a single deity." And now we can briefly address the theory that Adonai, or Yahweh, was brought into the Israelite pantheon as a second-tier deity who adopted the profile of Baal. And I'll provide another quote by Dr. Heiser. He stated this, "The biblical writers of Deuteronomy 32, 6 through 7 utilized vocabulary associated with El and Baal in Ugaritic material to describe Yahweh. This is no surprise since, as it is well known by Hebrew Bible scholars, the biblical writers associated epithets and other descriptors of both deities with Yahweh, a phenomenon at times used as evidence for an original Israelite polytheism." And he goes on to say that by all accounts in critical scholarship, this conceptual fusion occurred prior to the 8th century BC. But note that this fusion is not a fusion of Elyon and Yahweh, but of certain attributes of El and Baal with Yahweh. And that's the end of Dr. Heiser's quote. But based on these statements and all the prior evidence provided, I would agree with Dr. Heiser, and I would also put forth that it is more coherent to identify Elyon and Yahweh within Deuteronomy 32 as the same deity. And rather than Yahweh being brought into the Israelite pantheon and adopting the divine profile of Baal, the biblical writers used epithets of Baal to describe Yahweh. This is classic polemic literature. And they did this to demonstrate Yahweh's superiority as the true Most High. And what truly lies at the heart of this issue on whether Yahweh and Elyon are two distinct deities within Deuteronomy 32 is the idea that Israelite religion evolved from polytheism to monotheism, and that this evolution of monotheism was essentially completed during or shortly after the exile. And there are several assumptions used to prop up this idea, and one of these concerns the presence of plural Elohim within the biblical text. This term Elohim is used in the Hebrew text to describe at least 6 different types of beings: Yahweh or Adonai, members of Adonai's council, gods and goddesses of other nations, demons. There should be an asterisk by that one. That one's Deuteronomy 32:17, and there is some discretion as to what the term Shadim, which is what is being described as an Elohim, actually means, but many will lean toward it meaning demon. It also is used to describe the deceased human dead. We see this specifically when the prophet Samuel is raised up. If you're familiar with that, many translations will render the text, "I see a spirit coming," but that word translated spirit is actually the term Elohim in the Hebrew. And it's also used to describe angels or the angel of Adonai. So from this, what do we gather that the term Elohim actually means? Although we tend to think of it just as meaning God or gods, a more appropriate definition of Elohim would be a resident of the spiritual realm. And this is important when we consider that there's evidence within the New Testament that shows that the term angelos, which is the Greek word for messenger, which we often translate as angels, had become a word deemed appropriate to generally describe a member of the supernatural realm, just as Elohim is used in the Old Testament. In regard to this, in one of his papers, Dr. Heiser stated, it is simply a fact that the Septuagint is uneven in its treatment of plural Elohim, as it uses the plural of theos, or God, and sons of God, in passages where the Hebrew would be plural Elohim. The uneven use of angelos cannot be coherently defended as indicating a theological shift in Jewish thinking about divine plurality. The Qumran material also mars that picture due to the numerous instances of plural Elohim, often in divine context in those texts. And this is a quick look at Dr. Heiser's website. You can see here I've got divine plurality in the Dead Sea Scrolls pulled up, and there were 2 handouts that were posted on here, and they had to do with occurrences of plural Elim and Elohim, as well as plural Malachim. And this first document is the plural Elim and Elohim. There's over 200 references to these plural Elim and Elohim in non-biblical Qumran text. And it's 35 pages. You can scroll through the entire thing and see all the references. He's laid it out very well. And the same thing here with the Malachim. And this document actually includes the English translation along with the Hebrew. And I believe the correlation between this terminology is important because we may have a tendency to think there is a big difference between a text that states the angels of God as opposed to the sons of God. But in reality, when we compare these terms and see that angelos and Elohim are both used within their time, culture, and context to describe members of the spiritual or supernatural realm, the issue becomes far less problematic, if problematic at all. And when we accept this definition, rather than the definition of Elohim being gods, we can see that biblical monotheism can be identified as Yahweh being the supreme Elohim above all other Elohim. Therefore, the presence of other Elohim does not dismiss the idea of monotheism. And if you want more information on this, specifically of the biblical divine council, you need to check out Dr. Heiser's work on Psalm 82, whether it's via YouTube, his books, or articles. And another assumption of this evolution of Israelite religion is what the majority of this video has been concerned with, and that is the distinction between Yahweh and Elyon within the biblical text. And this video has presented the case that Yahweh and Elyon should be identified as the same by examining Deuteronomy 32 and relating passages. And one of the consequences about the assumption that Israelite religion evolved from polytheism to monotheism is that unfortunately this assumption has influenced the exegesis of various passages and phrases within Deuteronomy, and I would say outside of Deuteronomy as well. And that due to these assumptions, arguments are presented that are based on flawed presuppositions. But when these assumptions and presuppositions are stripped away, and the text is examined from a data standpoint, the evidence points in favor of biblical monotheism throughout the biblical text rather than an evolution from polytheism to monotheism. All right, everyone, now it's your turn to join into the discussion. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to get your own copy of Dr. Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm if you are curious to learn more on this topic. Thank you all so much, and be sure to check out this video that YouTube thinks that you will like. And as a shout out to Dan, I don't have cool shirts like you, but I do have this free comic book that I got from my buddy who owns a comic book store. So that's my shout out to you, Dan. All right, everyone, see you next time. Thanks so much.